The morning fog clung to the rolling hills of Alsace like an ancient shroud, thick enough to soften the shape of every tree and swallow the edges of distant fields, but not enough to muffle the metallic clicks of Ethan Walden's careful hands as he adjusted his battered Springfield rifle. To Ethan, the rifle was not simply a weapon. It was a field instrument, its worn iron sights speaking to him in a language only he seemed to understand. Behind him, gathered near a cluster of damp stones, his fellow soldiers watched with thinly veiled amusement. They whispered and chuckled about his self-proclaimed blind spot sniper shot, a technique they believed to be nothing more than a fantastical idea spawned by sleepless nights and nervous tension. To them, the notion of hitting a target you could not fully see was absurd. To Ethan, it was simply the art of reading the unseen, the invisible mathematics of war. Ever since he'd arrived on the European front, Ethan had been treated as an anomaly, a gentle oddity among hardened young men who had learned to survive by embracing a brutal pragmatism. He wasn't broad-shouldered or imposing, nor did he possess the stoic coldness that many sharpshooters wore like armor. But in the quiet spaces between gunfire and marching orders, he demonstrated a rare attentiveness, a profound sensitivity to the subtle movements of the world. Ethan noticed things others did not: the microscopic sway of the grass before a gust arrived, the faint ripple of heat radiating off metal at great distance, the slight distortion of light when passing through morning fog. He called these irregularities revealed blind spots, believing that, when properly understood, they formed a map of predictable truths. Most men ignored such details. Ethan built his entire skill set upon them. His comrades didn't share his fascination. Instead, they turned it into entertainment. They mocked him with relentless creativity, crafting new nicknames almost daily: the Bullet Whisperer, Fog Prophet, Wizard of the Wind. Some of the jokes were affectionate, others more biting, but Ethan absorbed them all with the same mild smile. He knew they did not understand, and he did not blame them. To most men, shooting was a physical act. To Ethan, it was an equation that required humility, patience, and constant recalibration. He did not expect the platoon to grasp how deeply he studied each variable, nor how precise his understanding had become. Behind that smile, however, lived a steadfast confidence. Ethan had spent countless hours running drills that no one had assigned, constructing makeshift experiment stations using stones, tin scraps, and branches. He tracked bullet paths by marking trees and recording slope angles, wind temperatures, and humidity levels. His notebook, always tucked in his breast pocket, was filled with pages of calculations, diagrams, and cryptic shorthand only he could decipher. While others slept or played cards, he tested theories. While others joked, he solved problems. The platoon never knew how often he hit near-impossible shots during these private sessions. He wasn't chasing glory, he was refining a craft he believed would eventually matter. His moment arrived on a frigid October afternoon when the platoon received urgent intel. A high-ranking Nazi officer, infamous for orchestrating deadly counterstrikes, had been spotted in a fortified observation post overlooking the valley. The officer's role was strategic and lethal. He identified Allied movements and relayed precise coordinates that often resulted in devastating artillery strikes. Removing him could save dozens of soldiers. Failing to do so could cost them the ridge, the valley, and perhaps their lives. But the challenge was formidable. Reconnaissance described the officer standing behind a steel-reinforced barrier, visible only through a narrow slot that shifted unpredictably as a hanging camouflage sheet fluttered in the capricious valley wind. Multiple trained snipers had attempted the shot over the past day, each failing to achieve a clear line of sight before the target disappeared again. Every near opportunity dissolved as the cloth snapped back into place like a living barrier. When volunteers were requested, the room fell silent, until Ethan stepped forward. His movement was so natural, so calm, that some mistook it for a misunderstanding. But the officers saw the steady resolve in his eyes and knew he was serious. His fellow soldiers exchanged glances of disbelief. Some snorted, others muttered that he'd finally lost it. Yet none tried to stop him. He simply collected his rifle, slung his ammunition pouch over his shoulder, and walked out into the biting cold. At the ridge, Ethan settled into position among twisted roots and frost-hardened shrubs. He could feel the cold biting through his gloves, numbing his fingertips, but he embraced the discomfort as part of the environment he needed to understand. Before even raising the scope, he closed his eyes and listened to the wind moving through the valley. The pattern was complex, a mix of long, sweeping gusts and intermittent spirals that collided unpredictably. To most it was chaotic. To Ethan it was a rhythm waiting to be parsed. When he finally lowered his cheek to the rifle stock and peered through the scope, he found exactly what he expected. The observation point was obscured, the officer barely a silhouette flickering behind the cloth. But outlines were unnecessary. Ethan didn't need to see the target clearly, he needed only to understand where the target would be at the precise moment the cloth shifted. He began tracing invisible lines, imagining how the bullet would travel through layers of moving air, adjusting in microdeviations as it encountered different temperatures and wind densities. Behind him, the platoon members who had followed out of curiosity settled into their own vantage points. They whispered joking bets not meant to be cruel but born of habit. Most expected failure, though a few harbored quiet hope. Ethan ignored their murmurs. His entire focus was absorbed into the delicate interplay of wind, cloth, and distance. Every breath he took aligned with the land itself, long, steady, and controlled. The wind began to follow the sequence he had predicted earlier that morning. A long easing, a sudden drop, followed by a brief moment of unnatural stillness. This pattern repeated at intervals, and Ethan timed each one, counting heartbeats instead of seconds. He sensed another pause approaching, the subtle quiet that always came just before the valley exhaled again. The cloth jerked upward, but the timing was wrong, still too turbulent. Ethan didn't flinch. The cloth rose again, too high, too uneven. He kept his breathing slow, exhaling clouds of mist that dissolved into the cold air. Each misaligned lift confirmed his calculations, reaffirming that the perfect moment had not yet arrived. Then it happened. The valley wind fell silent. The cold air flattened. The vegetation stilled. Ethan felt the shift before he consciously recognized it, as if the land were holding its breath. This was the moment he had prepared for, the fleeting heartbeat where chaos aligned into perfect predictability. He adjusted the rifle a few degrees away from the slit, aiming not at where the officer was, but where he would be in the next 3/4 of a second. Ethan's finger rested against the trigger with mathematical precision, his breathing nearly imperceptible. Everything narrowed, the world, the wind, his purpose, until only the shot existed. As the cloth lifted with delicate slowness, exactly on cue, Ethan fired. The bullet carved through the wind, bending along the invisible pathways Ethan had anticipated, grazing the fabric by a margin too small to measure. It slipped through the slit in the barrier precisely as the officer leaned forward, his expression sharpening in curiosity just before the impact struck with fatal accuracy. A metallic clatter echoed from the observation post as the officer's body collapsed backward, the sound carrying through the valley like a muted bell. His men scrambled in confusion, ducking behind cover, unaware of what had just pierced their stronghold. Behind Ethan, silence swallowed every murmur. The platoon stood frozen, wide-eyed, their earlier jokes dissolving into the cold air. Their disbelief was palpable, awe mixing with shock, the realization dawning that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that defied the usual laws of marksmanship. Ethan lowered his rifle with the calmness of a man completing a routine chore rather than a once-in-a-lifetime feat he neither celebrated nor sought acknowledgement. Instead, he nodded softly to himself as though verifying a hypothesis. The shot had behaved exactly as predicted. That was all that mattered. Finally, a young soldier broke the silence with a hoarse whisper, asking what kind of magic Ethan had performed. Ethan paused for a moment before responding in a tone so gentle it was almost a sigh. No magic. Just a blind spot revealed. The platoon erupted into movement. Some laughing in astonished disbelief, others cheering or shaking Ethan's shoulders with newfound respect. A few simply watched him with silent admiration, trying to comprehend how a man they considered eccentric had just changed the course of their mission with a single bullet. Ethan, however, walked through the commotion like a quiet ghost, heading back toward camp with steady steps and eyes lowered. Word of the impossible shot spread through the regiment faster than wildfire. Men who hadn't been there embellished the story, claiming the bullet curved in the air like a thrown boomerang or calling it a ghost shot guided by the fog. Others argued it was pure luck, refusing to accept a technique so unconventional. But those who had witnessed it understood. Ethan had not stumbled into success. He had engineered it. That evening, after the excitement faded and the camp grew quiet, Ethan sat alone on a wooden crate at the outskirts of the encampment, cleaning his rifle by lantern light. The metallic clicks echoed faintly in the chilled silence. He wasn't thinking about praise or skepticism. He was thinking about the patterns that governed the unseen, the natural forces that whispered truths to those patient enough to listen. Ethan knew the war would demand more of him, more impossible shots, more problems no standard manual could solve. He also knew people would continue to doubt until the moment they needed him again. But doubt didn't bother him. To Ethan, disbelief was just another form of wind, and wind, no matter how unpredictable, could always be measured, understood, and mastered. When he finally set his rifle aside and leaned back, muscles aching, he allowed himself a quiet, fleeting smile. They had laughed at his blind spot sniper shot. They had doubted him, teased him, dismissed him. But today that very technique had saved them. And in war, where survival often hinged on the improbable, Ethan's strange brilliance had finally found its purpose.